It's not the beginning of the end, but it is the end of the beginning.
The Palestine mandate is ended. Britain is relieved of a burden. Sir Alan Cunningham takes leave of the troops who have shown exemplary patience in a thankless task. 10 weeks more are required for complete withdrawal. With the end of the mandatory power, all legal bars to immigration are removed. The seas are now open to the seekers of the promised land. The refugees from memories of war-scarred Europe land in a country already in the grip of bitter racial strife. Abdullah of Transjordan, Farouk of Egypt, and Ibn Saud of Arabia unite the Arab world against the Jewish state. Abdullah alone commands an efficient fighting force, the Arab Legion, trained and equipped by Britain under the terms of her treaty with Transjordan. Unless United Nations declare Abdullah the aggressor, Britain remains bound by the treaty. Upon this king of a small state rests the responsibility of a world statesman. The lives of countless people hang on his decisions. May he act wisely.
For over a year now, I have been telling the story about the creation of the modern state of Israel. This is part 4 of what will eventually be a 5-part series, and if you're wondering why I haven't covered some certain detail, it's probably I either covered it in a previous video, or I will cover it in the next video. And this series itself is a follow-up to another series I did about the Palestine Mandate. I try to make each video as standalone as it can be, and so although you can definitely watch this one without having watched all the previous others, you will get more out of it if you watch the previous, I guess now, 7 videos. But with that preamble out of the way, my name is Grant, and you are watching Casual Historian. Let's get started. A mere 11 minutes after Israel issued its proclamation of independence, the U.S. announced its de facto recognition of Israel, with President Truman instructing Ambassador Warren Austin to deliver a message to the United Nations Security Council.
If the Security Council should decide that it is necessary to use armed force to maintain international peace in connection with Palestine, the United States would be ready to consult under the Charter with a view to such action as may be necessary to maintain international peace.
Much of the U.S. delegation to the UN had tried to undermine Truman's support for the establishment of a Jewish state, which forced the State Department to convince them to stay on the job afterwards and put their focus on obtaining a ceasefire with the Arabs. In Israel, there were public celebrations, but their soldiers on the front line would have to wait. Future Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin recounts his experience listening to the proclamation on the radio with his troops in the Palmach. Our weary troops strained to catch the portent of his words. One soldier who was curled up in a corner in a state of complete exhaustion opened a bleary eye and pleaded, "Hey guys, turn it off. I'm dying for some sleep. We can hear the fine words tomorrow." Someone got up and turned the knob, leaving a leaden silence in the room. I was mute, stifling my own mixture of emotions. None of us had ever dreamed that this was how we would greet the birth of our state. The Arab states greeted this proclamation with the expected condemnations, as well as calls for violent justice. This will be a war of extermination and momentous massacre, which will be spoken of like the Mongolian Massacre and the Crusades. The ending of the British Mandate means the termination and abrogation of the promise contained in the Balfour Declaration. The Jews have no rights in Palestine. The Jews have no rights to local self-independence, as they rejected my previous proposals. I repeat my promise that Palestine inhabitants will freely determine their future. On the eve of Israel's independence, the Arabs pleaded with the British to delay their departure, hoping to buy more time. But by May of 1948, the British had had enough of Palestine.
British public opinion will permit no more expenditure of life and treasure. It will acquiesce no longer in the use of British forces and the squandering of British lives to impose a policy in Palestine which one or other of the parties is determined to resist.
Although Arab politicians were adamant about their inevitable victory in public, their generals were less certain. They had been slow to prepare, presuming that the war wouldn't actually happen, and that if it did, it would come quickly. As Benny Morris described it, the military and political leaders, gripped by a war psychosis, oscillated between complete contempt for the Jews and fatalism. all the members of the Arab League would try to push the burden of liberating Palestine from the Jews onto the others, while minimizing their own. The Syrians would claim they couldn't devote the necessary manpower because they needed to fend off Turkish aggression from the north. But the real reason was that Syria's president, Shukri al-Quwatli, had purged the army after the country gained independence in 1946. Under French rule, the Syrian military had mostly been used to put down rebellions, but al-Quwatli feared that the army was too powerful and might overthrow him. So he reduced its size from 30,000 to 7,000, intentionally keeping it weak, corrupt, and incompetent until he could reorganize it and staff its officer corps with loyalists. Additionally, al-Quwatli saw the Hashemites of Jordan and Iraq as bigger threats. In the aftermath of World War I, the Hashemites had tried to take over Syria by inciting a revolt against the French, and by the 1940s there were still numerous monarchist and Hashemite sympathizers among the Syrian elites, as well as ethnic and religious minorities, that saw them as more tolerant than the Sunni Arab Republicans. Jordan's army was the best trained, equipped, and led of the Arab states, and al-Quwatli was just as afraid, if not more so, of Jordan than of the Jews. The partition of Palestine gave him an opportunity to protect Syria's borders at his neighbor's expense. He supported the creation of the Arab Liberation Army and allowed them to base in southern Syria. The other Arab League members would contribute funds to feed and arm the ALA, while most of its ranks were filled with Syrian soldiers and officers that had been purged from the Syrian army proper, and having it stationed in the south served as a deterrent against potential Jordanian backstabbing. Despite this, with popular support for intervention in Palestine sparking riots across Syria, al-Quwatli couldn't stand by while Jews sought to make themselves equals in the Middle East, so he was forced to invade as well. Government appears to have led public opinion to brink of war and now unable to retreat. Demand for war led by students, press, and Muslim religious leaders. Manifestos of students and ulemas, alike uncompromising. The Saudis, lacking a land border with Palestine and being far more sparsely populated, put most of its efforts into pressuring Western governments, especially the United States, into changing their policies in relation to the Jewish state. Ibn Saud would tell American officials that recognizing Israel would irreparably damage U.S.-Arab relations. The state and defense departments, along with U.S. oil companies, were afraid the Saudis and other Gulf states might revoke their oil concessions, with an Aramco VP warning Secretary Marshall that the Saudis might sanction Western oil companies. But the perceived threat soon abated, as a State Department study circulated showing that only 6% of Western Europe's oil came from the Middle East. Additionally, Ibn Saud not only wanted to maintain good relations with the U.S., but also feared that the British might sponsor a Hashemite takeover of Arabia. King Abdullah had frequently compared Saudi control of Mecca to Jewish control of Palestine, and so Saudi opposition consisted mostly of vocal hand-wringing and sending a contingent of troops to fight alongside the Egyptians. Egypt had cited domestic disturbances for why it couldn't dedicate more troops to the fight, but as Jordan appeared to be preparing to annex all of Palestine for itself, King Farouk was pressured to counter growing Hashemite influence. But just like the Syrians, Egyptian generals did not believe they were prepared to fight a war against a standing army. The Egyptians had no real war aim at all, except to loot and destroy whatever the Jews had built. The only possible explanation, and it is a ridiculous one, is that they simply cannot bear our presence or forgive us for existing. And I find it hard to believe that the leaders of all the Arab states are and always have been so hopelessly primitive in their thinking. The Arab League's original war plan was drafted by Captain Wasif Tal of Jordan, which envisioned an 11-day campaign. The Lebanese and Syrians would come in from the north to capture Acre and Afula, with the Iraqis crossing at Acheson and meeting up with the Syrians, while the Jordanians drove west to Jenin, and then close in on Haifa with the Syrians and Iraqis. A second Jordanian force would move to Lydda and Ramla, while the Egyptians would move toward Jaffa and Tel Aviv from the south. But Tal's plan called for more soldiers than the Arab states could or were willing to muster. Because Jordan was the only one willing and able to put in the necessary bodies, King Abdullah was appointed commander-in-chief on May 13th, with the Iraqi general Nur-ad-Din Mahmud made chief of operations. With the exception of Egypt, the other Arab states could only provide token forces, which required the original plan to be scaled back, focusing on cutting off the Jewish settlements of the eastern Galilee from the coast, and Afula being the main target rather than Haifa. And that was presuming anybody would follow the plan once troops crossed the border. King Abdullah would unilaterally change the Jordanian part of the Arab League plan, and instead would focus on controlling as much territory west of the Jordan River as possible, with a focus on the cities of Jericho, Ramallah, Nablus, Hebron, and Jerusalem. He had 8,000 troops divided between 6 battalions, but they were short on ammunition and possessing only enough artillery shells for 10 days of fighting and light weapon ammo for 30. His goal was to control as much of the Arab portion of the partition as possible, while minimizing how much they fought the Jews, believing he would lose a prolonged war. Similar to Egypt and Syria, his policies were driven in part by populist outrage. As the British head of the Jordanian army, John Bagot-Glubb, said, "The politicians, the demagogues, the press, and the mob were in charge, not the soldiers. Warnings went unheeded. Doubters were denounced as traitors." The Arab statesmen did not intend war, but in the end they entered and ordered their commanders to advance as a result of pressure of public opinion and a desire to appease the street. The Israelis had been preparing for years. The Haganah had about 30,000 fighters by the time the proclamation was issued, but only 40% of them were actually armed due to British import restrictions. The Irgun and Lehi collectively added another 3,000 to the Israeli forces. But the departure of the British opened the floodgates for manpower, with Jewish refugees in Cyprus and across Europe beginning to make their way to the new Jewish state. By the start of the invasion, the Israelis had firm control over about 20% of the Mandate's original territory. At the start of the conflict, it was the arms shortage that was a bigger problem for the Israelis, rather than manpower. The British had restricted the direct importation of arms into Palestine, while continuing to supply Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt with arms directly. The U.S. had implemented a unilateral arms embargo of the entire region since December of 1947, while the British would reduce but not eliminate their sale of weapons to the Arabs beginning in February of 1948. The French, however, would continue unrestricted sales of arms to Lebanon and Syria until May 29th, when the UN Security Council placed a region-wide embargo, which saw both France and the UK cease their weapon sales as well. The Israelis were confused by the U.S. embargo. President Truman had overcome the inertia of his own State Department to support partition and independence, just to turn around and eliminate all means of materially supporting it. When Shimon Peres asked Avril Harriman about it in 1964, the veteran diplomat responded saying that it was one of Truman's biggest mistakes. The Soviets were a curious case. During the Arab-Israeli War, the Soviets supported the Israelis due to perceiving the Arab governments as little more than French and British pawns. Once the UN embargo was enacted, the Soviets, along with most of the Eastern Bloc, would cease what little weapon sales it had to the region, but the Soviets would allow Czechoslovakia to violate the embargo. This served two roles. It helped garner further influence for the Soviets in the young Jewish state, and since the Israelis paid for most of their purchases in US dollars, it allowed the importation of foreign currency into the Eastern Bloc, since its currencies were worthless outside of it. Foreign volunteers for the new Israeli Air Force would buy up aircraft in the US and Europe, fly them to Czechoslovakia, load them up with weapons and munitions, and then fly them to Israel. Most sources about the Arab-Israeli War focus on how the arms embargo was detrimental to the Israelis, but in the long run, it was more harmful to the Arabs. Prior to independence, all the Zionist militias had been building up their own covert manufacturing facilities in order to evade British import restrictions. The Arabs never needed to build their own because prior to February 1948, they had shown no intention of ever restricting their purchases, and thus they didn't bother stockpiling. But there was also the issue of rampant corruption within the Arab militaries. Officers sold weapons to Palestinian militias on the black market and marked up prices, and then pocketed the money. And since the British and French supplies seemed endless, the Arabs didn't develop alternative sources in Eastern Europe or the Western Hemisphere. In contrast, the Zionists were constantly navigating around international restrictions, and due to the long and storied Jewish diaspora, they had connections all over the world to help them. And so, although the Arabs had a short-term advantage when it came to access to heavy weaponry, their lack of domestic manufacturing as well as foreign supply chains made them weaker in the long run, despite their manpower advantage. Ben-Gurion would micromanage the war, requesting detailed reports of exact troop numbers and arms supplies on a near daily basis. This micromanaging included the creation of the Official Gazette, a government-owned publication meant to distribute reports on its activities. But it would also be used to distribute propaganda, some of which was used to sow disunity amongst the Arabs. They would publish details about King Abdullah's meetings with Golda Meir, but stretch the truth by claiming that Abdullah had secretly agreed to sign a treaty recognizing the Jewish state. But there's only so much preparation each side can do for a war, and as Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. 2 Syrian battalions crossed into Israel at Al-Hama and attacked numerous settlements across the Galilee, forcing the Haganah to retreat and abandon numerous settlements due to being spread out. They finally turned the Syrians back by the 20th, who retreated into the Golans. The remnants of the Arab Liberation Army would enter the Galilee from Lebanon, attacking the Palmach at al-Malakiyah, which would be traded back and forth between the Israelis and the ALA until October of 1948, when the IDF retook it for good. The Haganah would infiltrate Lebanon and successfully blow up a bridge over the Litani River, which prevented Syrian forces from crossing into Israel through Lebanese territory. In early June, the Syrians came down from the Golans again in hopes of gaining a foothold in the north, but only managed to gain a couple pockets along the western coast of the Sea of Galilee, which they would successfully hold on to until the end of the war. The Iraqis would cross the Jordan River with 5,000 troops at Gesher. Their primary target was the port of Haifa, in order to control both ends of the Mosul-Haifa pipeline. The Iraqi attack on Kibbutz Gesher would be repulsed by the settlers after a week of siege, forcing the Iraqis to regroup with Jordanian forces at Nablus. Iraqi forces stationed at Qalqilia would be stranded there after a platoon led by future Prime Minister Ariel Sharon covertly blew up a bridge across the Wadi, which halted the Iraqi push to the coast. And an Israeli offensive in the Jezreel Valley would capture the city of Jenin from the Arabs, and although it didn't completely rout the Iraqis, it convinced them to give up on reaching Haifa.
Passenger trains have ceased to serve Jerusalem. Goods trains are under fire from snipers. Primitive cowcatchers provide a poor defense against rail-planted bombs. Road transport moves behind an armor of steel plating, and only convoys with armed escort can hope to reach their destinations unmolested.
Before we continue on with the video, I would like to take a moment to thank my patrons and channel members for supporting Casual Historian. In particular, I'd like to thank my newest supporters, Candy Dub Official, Yanni Cohen, Kresh42, David Simon 4931, Doran, Arjun Palmerica, Dr. John C. Tellock, Connor, Dave Lindop, and Fire Lord Marklin. These supporters help keep the channel going when the algorithm or sponsors don't feel like giving the videos a fair shake. And I would love to be able to depend more on viewer support than on AdSense. Supporters get access to a number of perks, such as an exclusive Discord server, early access to ad and censorship-free versions of the videos, and getting your names in the scrolling chyron at the end of videos. And depending on what tier or level you join at, you also get access to the scripts I use to make the videos, as well as the notes I use to write those scripts. But at the end of the day, I know most of you who support me or any other creator do so because you want to see us make more and better stuff. And with your support, we can. So if you believe you get a lot out of these videos and you have the means to do so, then you should become a channel supporter. You can either click the join button below or go to patreon.com/casualhistorian and pick a tier that's right for you. The main difference between joining on Patreon versus joining via channel memberships is that channel memberships at the moment have fewer tier options, and Patreon also has the option of paying for a full year up front, which also gives you a discount on that membership. Thanks again to all the patrons and channel members for supporting Casual Historian, but for now, let's get back to the history. Most of the battles between Israeli and Jordanian forces were about controlling Jerusalem, which was an obsession for David Ben-Gurion. On May 14th, the Haganah captured the hills near the Arab village of Latron, which overlooked the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem highway. The sudden Egyptian push north toward Tel Aviv led the Israelis to redirect the Givati Brigade south to blunt their advance. Jordanian forces would occupy Ramallah, Lydda, Ramlah, Nablus, and on the 17th they captured the high ground around the village of Latron from the Israelis. This allowed them to continually harass convoys delivering men and supplies from Tel Aviv to western Jerusalem. Jordanian troops then moved from Ramallah to eastern Jerusalem, driving what few Israeli fighters were holding the northern routes to the city. Ben-Gurion's primary focus would be capturing the high ground around Latron, which strangled the main supply line keeping Israeli forces afloat in Jerusalem. He tasked its capture to Yigal Yadin, with many of the soldiers being poorly equipped, including untrained Holocaust survivors who had just arrived in Israel from camps in Cyprus. As I looked at their faces, I could not help wondering which of them would not be coming back. It seemed like a double or triple tragedy. They had survived the Holocaust, then the camps, and now they were faced with this. The Israelis launched their first attack on Latron on the night of May 24th, but it would fail. They launched a second attack on June 1st, which would also fail, killing at least 139 Israelis. Under the command of Yitzhak Rabin, the Palmach continued to run convoys past Latron to resupply Jerusalem. Ben-Gurion would order another attack on Latron for June 9th, but Yigal Allon and other brigade commanders opposed this mission and encouraged postponing it until other options were explored. Rabin was sent to convince Ben-Gurion to allow them to develop a secret path into Jerusalem that ran through a series of abandoned Arab villages that would become known as the New Burma Road, named for the supply route used by the Allies in World War II to resupply Chiang Kai-shek. Rabin's account of this meeting portrays Ben-Gurion as absolutely livid at Allon trying to usurp his role as commander-in-chief, and suggests that he wanted him shot. But Ben-Gurion would begrudgingly accept the plan and call off the June 9th attack. Ben-Gurion's anger at Allon makes a bit more sense in context of what had just happened in Jerusalem. The line between the new and old city had held pretty well, but the various Jewish fighters in the old city had been fighting in brutal room-to-room urban warfare. But after 2 weeks of siege, the ultra-Orthodox community of the Jewish quarter would surrender on May 28th, with its inhabitants forced to flee to the old city, except for the able-bodied men who would be taken prisoner. By the end of the war, there were no more Jews left in the eastern city. Down south, the Egyptian government had told the UN Secretary General that its troops were being sent into Palestine in order to restore order. They hoped to bypass most Jewish settlements along the way to Tel Aviv, but they would put up stiff resistance. 10,000 Egyptian soldiers were stationed at El Arish and were split into two groups, one going north along the coast, following the rail line toward Tel Aviv, and the other going east into the Negev and toward Beersheba, hoping to eventually link up with the Jordanians near Jerusalem. Prior to the arrival of the Egyptian army, Muslim Brotherhood volunteers began a siege of the Jewish settlement at Kfar Darom, with the defenders managing to hold off into July, even after the regular Egyptian army arrived. And although most other settlements near the southern coast didn't hold out as long, they all managed to hold out for multiple days while being greatly outnumbered. Future Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser was present for many of these, and saw how the Egyptian military would tell the media about their victories against the Jews hours or even days before it actually happened, all the while covering up the many incompetent tactics used. The drawn-out fighting in the south gave the Israeli government in Tel Aviv time to redirect their forces to the south. By the time the Egyptians reached Kibbutz Nitzanim on June 7th, their commanders had given up on trying to take Tel Aviv and instead decided to dig in around Isdud. And similar to the battles for Latrin, there were Holocaust survivors fighting in the kibbutzes of the south. Please, sir, don't send me to the trenches. I was in a concentration camp. I only got to Palestine 3 weeks ago. I want to live a little. He stared into the frenzied eyes of this man. He felt he was looking at a ghost. The man was already dead. He had died in Hitler's camps, just as surely as others had been asphyxiated in the gas chamber. Who knew what courage had died with him? The Israelis would launch Operation Philistia on June 2nd in order to halt the Egyptian march forward, sending part of the Givati Brigade to attack the Egyptians at Isdud. The Egyptian movement toward Beersheba faced less resistance due to the Haganah's presence spread out across the northern Negev. Now, during the fighting, we continue to see people fleeing their homes. Some of them were Jewish, but most were Arabs, and usually at the behest of local Arab leaders. But the Arab armies didn't want civilians fleeing their homes. Not only did they clog up the roads the armies typically traveled along, but they often would ask the armies for supplies or transportation away from the combat zones. The governor the Egyptians sent to rule over Gaza would issue a communique encouraging people to stay in their homes, but despite this, they continued to flee en masse to large population centers controlled by one or another of the Arab armies. How is it that I see confounded people pack their belongings and travel long distances in search of foreign lands, hastily deserting their cities, lands, homes, and relatives, and turning southward, where they have no shelter or refuge? I can assure you that Gaza is a safe haven protected by the Egyptian army against all enemies. I promise that our forces will not withdraw one iota from Gaza, and will maintain their deployment there and in the neighborhood, with a view to defending the area and its existence, come what may. And while fighting continued on the ground, diplomatic battles were being waged overseas. The UN Security Council imposed an arms embargo, which the US, UK, and France strictly enforced, while the Soviets allowed their puppets in Czechoslovakia to continue selling arms to the Israelis. To help pay for these arms, the Israeli government would send representatives to the US, such as Golda Meir, to speak to American Jews to raise money, managing to raise $150 million by the end of 1948. Half of this money would go to organizations helping take care of Jews left homeless after the Holocaust in Europe, while the other half were used to procure arms from anywhere they could get them. The UK Foreign Minister, Ernest Bevin, continued to advocate against Israeli interests even after the British forces departed Palestine, advocating that Jaffa Acre, and the Negev should be given to the Arabs, much of which seems to be rooted in a well-documented record of anti-Semitism. Friends of Bibin tell stories of him frequently making derisive remarks about Jews, claiming the Nazis learned about terrorism from the Jews in Palestine, and declaring the Old Testament to be one of the, quote, most immoral books ever written. The Mufti continued to advocate the creation of a government in exile for Palestine, but most Arab leaders were unwilling to work with him, and even other Palestinians were starting to see him as ill-fitted for the job of public figurehead of the cause. The Jordanians would pick the founder of the Arab Bank, Ahmad Hilmi Abd al-Baki, as the governor of Jerusalem, leading the Mufti to labeling him a traitor. From the start of the conflict, Israel's representatives at the UN worked tirelessly to try and get a ceasefire, but the Arab states routinely rejected it. They did offer one ceasefire on May 26, but that was on the precondition that the Jews reject the partition proposal of 1947, cease all Jewish immigration into Palestine, and give up on the idea of an independent Jewish state. To which the Jewish representative, Abba Eban, replied, "If the Arab states want peace with Israel, they can have it. If they want war, they can have that too. But whether they want peace or war, they can only have it with the sovereign independent state of Israel." Both the Soviets and Americans would speak out against Arab intransigence on May 28th and 29th. Their statements are the best evidence we have of the international character of this aggression. An existing independent government cannot be blotted out in that way. The Arab states are taking the only course that can be taken by them, and that is marching in with their armies and blotting the state out. This is a matter of international concern, a matter of so great importance that we cannot sit here and say, oh, we wash our hands of it. This is equivalent in its absurdity to a legend that these 5 armies are there to maintain peace and at the same time are conducting a bloody war. The Soviet delegation cannot but express surprise at the position adopted by the Arab states, and particularly the fact that these states, or some of them at least, have resorted to such action as sending their troops to Palestine and carrying out military operations aimed at suppression of the national liberation movement in Palestine. We can only wonder at the course taken by the Arab states, which have not yet achieved their own full liberation from foreign influence, and some of which have not even real national independence. On May 14th, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 186, which called for a ceasefire in the region, and for the Security Council to appoint a mediator. They would pick a member of the Swedish royal family, Count Folke Bernadotte, who arrived in Cairo on May 28th. Bernadotte had run the Swedish branch of the Red Cross and had saved the lives of thousands of Jews in Northern Europe. But he had also tried to end the Second World War by negotiating an armistice with the Nazis. He was frequently referred to as a humanitarian Don Quixote. Now, to his credit, he did eventually get a ceasefire on June 11th, but this had just as much to do with both the Israelis and the Arabs nearing the end of their supply chains and stockpiles as it did with any talent Bernadotte may have had. By the start of the ceasefire, the Jews controlled 270 square miles of territory originally allotted to the Arab state in the 1947 partition resolution, while the Arabs occupied 135 square miles of territory allotted to the Jewish state. Not a single Jew was left alive in the areas occupied by the Arabs, all of whom either fled or were slaughtered, and their remains regularly mutilated. The Syrians and Jordanians had lost 300 each, the Iraqis 200, and the Egyptians 600. The Israelis had nearly 1,200 dead, about 300 of them civilians, and they would spend the period of the truce rearming and reorganizing. The Israelis were in desperate need of a reprieve from fighting, and once the ceasefire was in effect, Ben-Gurion ordered their ambassador at the UN to prolong it for as long as possible. They would use this time to develop the Burma Road further in order to get more men and material to the fighting forces in western Jerusalem. The ceasefire agreement saw both sides agree to not import any additional arms, and although neither side actually planned on following that rule, the Israelis at least cared about looking like they were following it. And so they would try to circumvent these restrictions, either by bringing in new arms at night or dropping them off away from ports and from places where UN observers were likely to see them. The fighting had begun when the Israelis had 4 different fighting units: the Haganah, Palmach, Irgun, and Lehi. Additionally, there were the Orthodox Jews who had refused to serve in the Haganah up until this point, and didn't follow the instructions to enlist. The former of these 2 problems was addressed by ordering the Haganah to follow the same kosher laws and Sabbath observances as the Orthodox community, who had been demanding the establishment of separate Orthodox units. The provisional government would also appease the ultra-Orthodox Haredi community by giving a waiver to everybody actively studying in the yeshuv. This was intended as a temporary policy to get the country through the war, but to this day it is still the policy of the Israeli government. As for the militias, the provisional government began a program of reorganization after it declared independence. And on May 26th, Ben-Gurion would write a memo declaring that the Haganah was now called the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, which was the official military of the State of Israel, and that no other armed groups would be allowed to operate independently. This announcement was preceded by behind-the-scenes negotiations between Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin, the head of the Irgun. The revisionists didn't trust the establishment and vice versa. The Israeli left didn't want to work with the revisionists, citing events like Deir Yassin, while the revisionists were still angry at Ben-Gurion for declaring open season on the Irgun and Lehi during World War II. Begin tried to negotiate some kind of autonomy for the Irgun and Lehi, or possibly separate military units within the IDF, but Ben-Gurion refused to allow any identifiable ethnic, religious, or political groupings to have its own units or divisions, fearing it could form the basis for future civil wars. The head of Lehi, Yitzhak Shamir, arrived in Tel Aviv on May 20th after spending the previous 2 years at a British internment camp in Eritrea. When he heard about the order disbanding the independent militias, he supported it, and with his blessing, 90% of Lehi members would join the IDF. The remaining 10% would continue operating abroad and in East Jerusalem, which was under Jordanian occupation. Begin and Ben-Gurion had extremely hard feelings toward each other. Begin hadn't been invited to sign Israel's Declaration of Independence, nor had he been invited to the ceremony where it was read aloud for the first time. Instead, he would give his own radio address the next day, invoking the name of God, whereas Ben-Gurion and the provisional government had been afraid to. This event has occurred after 70 generations of dispersion and unending wandering of an unarmed people, and after a period of almost total destruction of the Jew as Jew. Thus, although our suffering is not yet over, it is our right and our obligation to proffer thanks to the Rock of Israel and his Redeemer for all the miracles that have been done this day, as in those times. We therefore can say with full heart and soul on this first day of our liberation from the British occupier, blessed is he who has sustained us and enabled us to have reached this time. We shall go on our way into battle, soldiers of the Lord of hosts, inspired by the spirit of our ancient heroes, from the conquerors of Canaan to the rebels of Judah. God, Lord of Israel, protect your soldiers. Grant blessing to their sword that is renewing the covenant that was made between your chosen people and your chosen land. Arise, O Lion of Judah, for our people, for our land, on to battle, forward to victory. On May 28th, an alliance between the militias and the IDF was announced, with the Irgun agreeing to be fully absorbed on June 1st. Both Lehi and the Irgun would hand over their weapons caches, as well as manufacturing facilities, over to the newly formed IDF. Due to the agreement stating that the Irgun and Lehi would not act independently within Israel, some revisionists interpreted that as meaning they could do so outside Israel. This led to Irgun and Lehi cells in the US and Europe continuing recruiting fighters, as well as procuring arms and sending them back to Israel. Additionally, Irgun and Lehi cells continued to operate in eastern Jerusalem, which hadn't been given to the Jewish state in the UN partition resolution, and both of these contingents would cause troubles for Israel proper. The revisionists had been active in the United States under several front organizations, such as Betar, which had been the youth wing of the Irgun founded by Zev Jabotinsky in Latvia in the 1920s. Many American Jewish GIs who had been members of Betar before World War II would join the Irgun afterward, with many using the GI Bill of Rights to study at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. The Irgun would partner with the Jewish Agency to transport their Betar recruits to Israel via the agency's front organization. Numerous attempts to deliver volunteers after the British left failed, when they stopped at another port where local authorities boarded and arrested them, such as what happened to the SS Marine Karp after it stopped in Beirut on its way to Haifa. Lebanese authorities rounded up all the Jewish males aboard the ship and sent them to a prison camp in Baalbek, deporting them back to the US over a month later. The Irgun's front organization in the US, called the American League for a Free Palestine, was headed by Hillel Cook, who usually went by the name Peter Bergson while in the US. Before the mandate was officially terminated, Cook had purchased a ship named Altalena and sent it to France to pick up weapons and recruits the Irgun cells had in Europe. It was supposed to arrive by May 14th, but it got delayed by over a month, not arriving until late June. Under the command of Captain Eliyahu Lankin, the Altalena set sail from France on June 11th. Menachem Begin only learned about it on June 12th, after it was reported by the BBC. He tried to get the ship to stop and turn around, but the captain refused to reply. Lenkin later claimed that the message was encoded, and he didn't have the cipher to decode it. Begin then tried to contact the head of the Irgun in France, Shmuel Katz, but he received no reply from him either. After several days of radio silence from both Paris and Altalena, Begin would inform the provisional government about what was going on. After this, he was finally successful at making contact with Captain Lenkin and instructed him to bring the ship to the coast near Kfar Vitkin, just north of Tel Aviv, in order to avoid UN observers enforcing the arms embargo. Begin began negotiating with the government about handing over the weapons. The overseas Irgun cells had wanted the arms to go to the Irgun's fighters still operating independently in eastern Jerusalem, but Begin had signed an agreement to dissolve the Irgun, so he tried to get the IDF to agree to let 20% of the weapons aboard the ship go to fighters in Jerusalem, with the rest being given to the IDF. By the time the Altalena reached Crete on June 18th, Begin had reached an agreement with the IDF Chief of Staff, Israel Galili, who had promised that 20% of the weapons would be used in Jerusalem, but he didn't specify whether they would be delivered to the revisionists in eastern Jerusalem or to the IDF soldiers in western Jerusalem. The crisis that followed would be the result of a series of misunderstandings and an attempt to write one faction out of the history of Israel's founding. The Altalena would reach the eyesight of Israel the evening of June 19th. Begin himself, along with a number of former Irgun members who had gone AWOL from the IDF units, met them at the beach near Kfar Vitkin to help unload the ship in the dead of night. Early on the morning of the 20th, the Israeli cabinet held an emergency meeting in which Ben-Gurion claimed that Begin had not warned him about the incoming Altalena and issued an announcement declaring the Irgun and Lehi traitors. Israel Galili would interpret the decision as an order to sink the ship. Ben-Gurion believed that Begin was launching a coup. There are not going to be two states, and there are not going to be two armies, and Mr. Begin will not do whatever he feels like. We must decide whether to hand over power to Begin or to tell him to cease his separatist activities. If he does not give in, we shall open fire. The Irgunists had begun loading the ship in the early hours of June 21st. The IDF appeared at the beach, with General Dan Evan issuing Begin an ultimatum: hand over all the weapons and submit to the IDF, or the ship will be sunk and Begin will be held personally responsible. Begin dismissed the ultimatum, saying that he had already reached an agreement with Galili to distribute 20% of the weapons to the fighters in East Jerusalem. The tensions continued to rise until shots were fired, and all hell broke loose. Nobody knows who fired the first shots, with eyewitnesses claiming each side had fired first. Begin would board the Altalena shortly after the firing started, and gave the remaining Irgunists on the beach an order to surrender to the IDF, while the ship would sail for the port at Tel Aviv, hoping to speak with Ben-Gurion and Galili in person. News of the incident spread quickly. The government sent a final ultimatum to Begin, ordering them to evacuate the crew and passengers of the ship and let the IDF handle the unloading of the weapons. Begin said he would agree, but only if one of his representatives could stay aboard the ship as well, but the government refused. When the ship arrived at Tel Aviv to begin unloading, the IDF opened fire on them, and the Irgunists returned fire against Begin's orders. The IDF would allow the wounded to be evacuated from the ship, but then used artillery to sink the ship and its arms into the Mediterranean. The incident resulted in the death of 16 revisionists and 3 IDF, along with the arrest of hundreds of known and former affiliates with the Irgun and Lehi. 8 IDF members who had refused to fire on fellow Jews would later be court-martialed. News of the incident reached Batar members in the U.S., who organized demonstrations outside the Jewish Agency's offices in New York. This caught Abba Eban off guard, considering that the provisional government haven't even acknowledged that the incident had happened yet. Begin himself wasn't arrested, but he would return to his apartment in Tel Aviv, soaking wet from having jumped overboard before the Altalena was sunk. He would go to his home radio and broadcast his side of the story. There must not be a civil war with the enemy at our gates. Not one bullet against the Jews. Our enemy is the Arabs. Although Begin did not call for an uprising against the government, several days later he would release a pamphlet to fully explain the incident, where he would call Ben-Gurion a power-hungry dictator who would lock up dissidents in concentration camps. The State Council meets on June 23rd to discuss the incident, where Ben-Gurion claims Begin only told him about the Altalena on the 19th, despite having been told directly by Begin 3 days earlier, and probably having heard the same BBC report from the 12th. Ben-Gurion also claimed that no agreement to give weapons to the Irgun fighters had been made. He made it his life's mission to demonize Begin and the revisionists, labeling them all as terrorists. This is why Ben-Gurion would eventually publish The Revolt in 1952, in an attempt to exonerate himself. He would claim that Ben-Gurion was the one actually trying to start a civil war by using state violence to eliminate a political rival. 2 members of the State Council would resign after Ben-Gurion refused to open a commission of inquiry to investigate the incident. The Israelis had just survived the first month of fighting, and by the skin of their teeth avoided a civil war. They still had a long way to go, but I'm afraid that's where I have to end this video. If you're interested in digging deeper into any of the things I covered in this video, my sources, as well as my footnotes, are listed in the description below. Thanks again to my patrons and channel members for supporting Casual Historian, in particular, my producer level patron, Ryan Powers, for their continued support. If you'd like to support the channel yourself, you can click the join button down below or go to patreon.com/casualhistorian and pick a tier that's right for you. If a monthly commitment is a little too rich for your blood, then you can also support the channel through a one-time contribution via PayPal. You could also support the channel by getting me a book off of my Amazon wishlist. I'd also like to thank some viewers for getting me a couple books recently. There's the Volume 1 of the Persepolis graphic novel, which I will probably use when I get around to doing a video about the Islamic Revolution. And I'd also like to thank another viewer for getting me this book, The Jews and the Left, which will be useful for a bunch of projects in the near future, I am very sure. So links to my PayPal as well as my Amazon wishlist can be found in the description below. And if you can't contribute materially or monetarily, then I always do appreciate you guys leaving comments down below, sharing the videos, and subscribing to the channel. You could also click the bell icon to turn on notifications to make sure you do not miss when the final installment of the series comes out. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.